Hello folks, it's been around 4 months now, but better late than never, I suppose. Now, this will be much more serious than usual and also quite longer due to the subject at hand. I don't intend to make a habit out of it, but this is something I need to bring up. So, you might have noticed I've been quite absent in general. That's in no small part due to my personal endeavors. I've been writing my book, for instance, and it's been an absolutely draining pastime. Another part of it is the state of flux that 2038 finds itself in. It's really not wise or sustainable to make videos when things may change drastically between patches. With that said, we're also quite close to beta by now, so some stability is bound to come soon. But another far deeper issue that one such as myself may come across is the actual subject of, well, this video. The complexity of the game and the multitude of opinions on it is a wonderful thing to observe at first. But inevitably it leads to creative differences across the board, ones which over time become quite demotivating since it soon becomes apparent that reconciling opposing camps is a monumental task. First, to elaborate on what exactly I mean, this may drag on for a bit and I'll be referencing points that have been made before. So I'll try to provide timestamps to thematic sections, so to speak, which you may find in the description and the comments. With that said, let's begin. For one, Hellgate has found itself in a very peculiar situation. Given its unique and troubled development process, one could argue it's always found itself in something of a limbo between SP and MP. I've touched on this subject before in my SP and MP retrospective, so here are some relevant pieces of that exploration. What I'm interested in lies between single player and multiplayer. What was Hellgate trying to be exactly? To try to answer that, I'll need to start from the basics and make my way into Flagship's last MP patch before the IP changed hands. So, all classes seem to be fundamentally built in line with MMO archetypes. The Marksman is a ranged glass cannon, the Guardian is a low damage tank, and so forth. However, all classes faced the same issue. They would have to be able to perform alone, instead of having to rely on a party to balance out their weaknesses, since their single player counterparts would have no such option by definition. The first step towards fixing this situation came in a reasonable realization. SP and MP characters would have to be unique to their game modes and classes would need to be balanced separately. The finest example of this would be CCM, Critical Chance Multiplier. This affix facilitated critical builds and it came in very high amounts. In an MMO setting, however, and given how utterly OP such builds can become, especially given how critical damage was designed and handled, this could lead to parties being far too efficient at slaying demons. Put simply, it would create a massive stat inflation by the end, save for draconian restrictions and failsafes. Now, surgically precise party modifiers could somehow help alleviate the issue, but the clock was ticking. So instead, CCM was drastically reduced in MP compared to SP. Other affixes that posed similar dangers were also given the same treatment. At this point, another factor comes into play. SP was arguably meant to be kind of a training ground for MP, and both would follow the same story. The story would conclude at level 30, and players would play through the game again, starting at level 30. This was Nightmare Mode, a nod to the Diablo series that Flagship had taken part in creating. However, this is also where the clock-ticking element becomes visible. Up until level 30, much attention has been paid to balance. That's the last level where new skills are unlocked, and up to that level there's multiple different uniques and even lower grades such as legendaries and rares that all try to provide some unique option. After level 30, however, things become rather grim. Unique gear becomes less diverse, new skills stop being acquired, and scaling is left to function pretty much alone. Specifically, the Abyss introduces such a massive spike in difficulty that it should be perceived as a party-based expansion, especially at level 30 when it's first accessible. That's not to say that the Abyss cannot be played solo, especially given the aforementioned lack of polish and the unbalanced state of classes that came with it. But the Abyss also contains another factor. Going by the game's data, the Westminster Catacombs seem to have been designed as a raid area, a concept that was completely new to the game at the time. Of course, sadly, this was never finalized. So, with all these factors in mind and what information we have available, I'm led to this assumption. Hellgate's MP and SP started together, and soon came the need to diversify them. SP remained isolated, while MP would gradually try to break away from their common roots. Thus, some features or areas would be balanced or designed around strict party play, while others would remain solo-friendly. So the base game would still be playable solo, not unlike Diablo, while designated content would become grounds for multiplayer. The direction of the game would indicate to me that, until just before it closed down, the MMO version of Hellgate was still trying to strike such a balance and still provide actual MP content, and the unreleased raid system was the final expression of this desire. Now, over the years, this dichotomy has inevitably seeped into one's overall outlook of the game. At their core, players seem to be mostly divided into two main groups, the one which wants most content to be beatable solo, and the one which wants most content to require parties to beat. So, in other words, the SP and MP crowds, respectively, the ones who side more with a solo ARPG direction, and the ones who prefer a party-oriented MMO direction. It's noteworthy that currently the two sides can somewhat coexist. Not much content requires a party to beat, but such content as Desi practically requires a party unless one is a summoner due to its petrification mechanics. Such areas as post-patch catacombs are also visibly harder to beat solo than they are with a group, mostly due to the difficulty modifiers and enemy density. So the two sides do coexist to an extent, and they tend to not advocate for extremes, such as all relevant endgame content becoming either completely solo viable or completely party reliant. Instead, each side mostly argues for the degree to which either approach manifests itself. Please note at this point, I'm not here to take sides in this discussion, not now anyway. I do have my own subjective opinions on most topics here, but at the moment those are irrelevant in this context. What's more, of course, it's not absolutely accurate to simplify opinions on such matters down to two sides, but for the sake of consolidating this analysis, I believe that's a liberty I can afford to take. This initial split can then inform one's views on other topics, mostly centered on player performance and overall difficulty. The finest examples of this likely include abyss difficulty and general boss kill speeds on the end of the environment, and pre-patch novas and crit on the end of player build-up and performance. To illustrate the depth of this discussion, I will use crit as an example, a massive topic in itself for a few reasons. Practically, it divides the players on grounds of performance. It seems that the more one agrees with an SP ARPG direction, the more they agree with high crit values as a means of beating the game, and the more one prefers an MP MMO direction, the more they'd rather see it lowered so that parties are more necessary. The same divide can be observed conceptually. The former crowd will often argue that all damage options, including crit, should be at the disposal of all classes, since skill sets only add flavor to what's otherwise a character beating a game. The latter crowd will often disagree, arguing that skill sets are what define classes and thus class direction. The ones who are naturally predisposed to crit should be the ones who get to excel at it, and others should have their own thematic means of increasing their damage output. So the two sides will find themselves in conflict on both practical and conceptual grounds. The general consensus is that what we now refer to as a crit build, in many cases a crit-capped state rather, is created by the existence of CCM, cast-specific crit multipliers, and CDB, critical damage, which is granted by mods but mostly by one's accuracy stat. I would argue that elemental damage and how it functions in crit calculations is also a noteworthy factor, but that does not enter the discussion as often. Of course, those are not the only grounds on which one decides where they stand on those affixes. For them, there are such arguments as CCM being a customization option for endgame gear, and that they are necessary for classes with no natural affinity for crit, such as evokers, to reach the desired performance levels. Against them, one may argue that the crit calculation invalidates the need for different elemental types, since they function identically, and that such individual performance invalidates the need for parties to be formed. The latter pair of arguments should illustrate quite well how where one stands in the SP-MP dichotomy tends to inform where they will then stand on such issues, since the desired end result differs. Again, this is of course not absolute. One may very well be more of a centrist, so to speak, or have views that don't exactly fit this mold I've presented. Still, I've found that this duality is a fair representation of the public discussions I've seen. Now, I've previously outlined how this subject affects future development, but for the sake of consolidating arguments, let me do so here as well. Regardless of where one stands on the issue, current crit values pose a unique problem. What most DPS classes can now achieve is roughly 95% crit chance and over 1000% critical damage, actually closer to 15 to 1600% in some cases. Those results can be achieved by just using LSCCM mods and stacking accuracy, and given the game's mechanics, there's no competition in terms of slot value, so those numbers dictate the caps of current player performance. In turn, this dictates future content difficulty and design liberties. If X performance is now possible, future content will need to be challenging for X performance. And since no other approach but crit can reach such performance, crit ends up being the sole factor that determines how stats are to be inflated. In the same vein, items that do not specifically favor crits are far less likely to be valuable. If crit is the standard against which value is measured, future items that attempt to break away from it are far less likely to have a practical purpose. How one tackles this is an issue all in itself. The consensus is that this becomes possible through CCM, CDB, and to a lesser extent elemental damage. So, before class specifics, extreme forms of interventions can include the following. Number 1, a complete removal of CCM. This group argues that CDB in itself is fine as long as it doesn't get to apply often. Low crit values will diminish the value of CDB, thus providing fewer incentives for players to stack accuracy. Number 2, a complete removal of CDB. This group argues that CC in itself is fine as long as it doesn't yield a massive damage increase. Low CDB values will diminish the value of CCM, thus providing fewer incentives for players to focus on crit over other options. Number 3, a complete removal of both CCM and CDB. This argument has rarely been brought up, but it would also be an option along the same lines. Removing both would leave players to work with CC and CDB mods alone, thus allowing class skillsets to be the front that dictates crit values. Of course, those are all extreme positions. One can subjectively argue that any one of them might be ideal, but such radical approaches are very rarely well received. More modest solutions may include more modest approaches, such as nerfing maximum CCM values, or nerfing down CDB returns from accuracy, or nerfing down elemental damage affixes, or any combination thereof. However, it does not end there. Between objective and subjective factors, a myriad of concepts may influence one's preferred direction, and then give rise to many questions, such as what CC and CDB values are desirable, and which classes should then be able to reach said numbers. Which options may then compete with said numbers, and in what way? What should be the value relation between mods themselves and between mods and skill sets? What boss skill speeds are actually desirable, and how do said numbers affect the economy? What shape should crits have? Should all skills of a class be able to crit? And if so, should they all benefit from the same crit source? How should skill sets interact with crit, if at all? Should, say, Hunter's Demolitions or Evoker's AoE spells crit? And should skills depend on crit the way, say, crit-based Hunter rounds used to? And so on, and so on. How one answers these questions is by definition very subjective, and most of those are not black and white questions. This of course makes it a subject that's incredibly hard to properly address, when it's not just two sides that need to find a middle ground, but many. What makes this discussion even harder to have at times is what I believe to be the distinction between objective and subjective, a distinction that is sometimes not made in such discussions. Now, one might argue that there is no such thing as objectivity when discussing a game. Enjoyment is to be found in it, therefore any topic of discussion is pretty much a clash of subjective opinions on how said enjoyment is to be found. However, I'll have to strongly disagree with this proposition. I've used these terms already, so let me explain what I mean when I do. What's objective in this context is what one can undeniably observe, while what's subjective is one's individual views on that observation. For example, to use the points I just mentioned on crit, the fact that increasing or decreasing possible boss kill speeds directly affects the economy, since it directly affects the flow of valuable items into the market, is objective. How one views an increased or decreased supply rate of such items and how that affects their enjoyment of the game is subjective. The fact that some classes are naturally predisposed to crit builds due to their skill sets is objective. Whether one would prefer to obey this design or disregard it for conceptual, practical, or other reasons is subjective. What CC and CDB values should exist and which classes should reach them and in what ways is also quite subjective. One may view them as a practical means to a desirable end, or an appealing way to build a class, or an enjoyable route to take when one reaches the end of the endgame progress curve. All very defendable positions. How crit builds perform compared to other options, however, is objective. One can extract numbers and gauge how different options perform, and then identify the factors that create the difference in performance. It is thus objective to pinpoint such factors, one that may include the existence of duo mods, the lenience of the feed system that allows one to stack accuracy and the CDB returns of accuracy, the maximum values of CCM and elemental damage mods, and the crit calculation itself and how it treats elemental damage compared to increased damage. What one does with such factors once they've been noted can be quite subjective by all means. What I mean to stress by this is that by nature this is not a strictly objective topic, one composed of just hard numbers. Nor is it fully subjective, one that only depends on one's personal views and tastes. That's exactly why you'll find that I often frame my public arguments with lenient, loaded, or otherwise diplomatic language. I want to be very careful about presenting my opinions, and I don't mean to imply that my opinions are facts if they're actually not. To drive this point home, let me dissect one of my own suggestions in this way. I initially brought it up, albeit in a slightly less solid form, in a half-serious video I made on how evokers are better summoners than summoners. For the sake of context, here are the relevant pieces of that argument. Venom Armor and Swarm. Are those summoner-appropriate spells? As much as Global and my personal tastes would say yes, not absolutely so. But still, why would they be fit for summoners? Both are literally supernatural toxic bugs that are summoned to be used, so they do fit thematically. It's also worth noting that, unlike most evoker spells, Swarm belongs to the Mind Power group, which is the group that Demon Commands belong to. Both could be of practical use, since summoners got Dark Form to spearhead their conceptual direction in the TC, which is melee. Venom Armor could provide defense, which melee range pretty much necessitates, as well as a reliable way to trigger Bronze Curse, since it strikes back when attacked, which, coincidentally, Flagship did try to emulate with Abandoned Fists. Now, Swarm could provide an AoE option which the class severely lacks. It would be a means of dealing personal damage, which, outside of Dark Form and guns, the class lacks. A way to actually make use of Foki outside of Dark Form, which the class mostly lacks. A reliable way to apply SFX, which the class lacks despite having Elemental Drain in its skill set. And a logical way to make use of Blood Shards, which the class lacks outside of Dark Form, for which Rip Shards were also designed. So, there's that. Lastly, Spectral Curse. Oh, but why does this spell fit summoners, I hear you say? It's a debuff which summoners lack and could use, since apparently they were meant to be a support class or one of many different paths. It's a damage booster which the class could use, and it's a curse which Kabbalists do tend to use. Alas, even when it could very reasonably be shared, not unlike Bronze Curse, this wonderful curse was only given to evokers. So, to expand on this and provide some more context, I'd like summoners to get Spectral Curse, and while they did get Swarm since that video was made, I'd also like it to be considered a minion, so that it's also affected by plus minion damage, the way Spectral Serpents currently behave. For that matter, I wouldn't quite mind them getting Spectral Serpents themselves for similar reasons. I based this suggestion mostly on grounds of thematic consistency within the faction, my perception of the conceptual nature of such skills, the role of the class, and my desire to have Foki and their mods be useful to the class beyond Dark Form auto-attacks. Now, it is actually objective that the class has very little use for Foki and their offensive affixes. Plus minion damage values on mods are minuscule compared to armor pieces and augments. Increased damage and splash do not affect most offensive spells outside of the recently acquired Toxic Tree, and the class does not have the proper assets to use crit efficiently. For the sake of clarity, by efficiently I mean to an extent that's comparable to either evokers or traditional minion builds. However, I do need to recognize that my belief that the class should thematically have such spells by any means, or that its role should include an AoE debuff, or that the issue of fucking mod values should be tackled in this specific way, is a highly subjective suggestion. How the class performs compared to other classes can be observed, and it's hard to argue that the class actually needs such additions as a means to an end. Therefore, my suggestion is for an optional addition that would appeal to me, and it's not one that's objectively needed. Such a suggestion would also need to be implemented very carefully in terms of point sinks and values, establishing a very clear trade between offense and defense. Otherwise, it would likely also be a very fair counter-argument on the part of evokers that such skills define their own class and their central assets, to the extent that sharing them with a class that arguably comes with more natural defense would actually invalidate them. That would of course also be subjective, but then we'd be clearly entering a discussion which would indeed be a clash of our subjective opinions. That is exactly why then I try to not be assertive on such matters if I can help it. I do tend to resort to numbers much more often than not, but I do need to acknowledge that one's opinions on a game cannot be strictly numbers and little more. It is a game at the end of the day, so subjective takes are not only inevitable but also essential. With that, however, I do believe I've made my point by now. There are many more examples of topics that boast similar complexity and thus lead to similarly deep discussions. What this all means to me, however, to return to the initial point of this video, is that this is a monumental task. A task that naturally leads to creative differences and conflict, and thus becomes a sizable source of fatigue and demotivation. It's worth mentioning that 2038 has been active for 3 years now, so many of these discussions are ones that we've actually had for years. And it isn't so much that I actually object to most of the team's creative decisions. If anything, I intentionally went to such lengths for this analysis to explain that that's far from the case. The crux of the issue lies in how the players are to be satisfied, and how we can best reconcile popular arguments and tastes with practical factors such as player progress and performance, and how quickly or effectively we're able to create new content. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that the game's complexity creates issues that are hard to handle, that people have different tastes, and that trying to appease all sides can be stressful. Of course, none of this means I'll be quitting or anything of that nature, but I did feel like providing a longer explanation of where I'm coming from. Speaking of length, I do hope this wasn't a terribly hard video to consume, and I do promise future content won't drag on this much. But just this once, I believe the subject warranted a break from the norm. With that said, as always, thank you for watching.